What follows is an examination of the historical record, the underlying market forces, and ongoing stresses to determine whether the United States economy is destined to experience yet another prolonged period of economic decline. The daily news on the state of the U.S. economy is often contradictory. Economists, government spokespersons, the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, and economic journalists each look at trends and statistics and offer differing views of where we are and where we're headed. What we must look at are the cumulative stresses building in key segments of the economy, government, and our society. Here's a look at the boom-to-bust nature of the U.S. economic system just since the beginning of the 1970s. The record after 1945 suggested to many that the beast has been more or less tamed. Yet the stresses that brought on depressions in the past emerged in 2008 to bring the global economy to the brink. Despite over a half century of changes in public policy, international agreements between nations, and a continuous expansion of our technological ability to achieve productivity gains, the cyclical character of our economies continues. This chart suggests things are looking up. The real answer requires us to look at the underlying components of how GDP growth is measured. Are more goods being produced and paid for out of earned incomes? Or does this reflect the ongoing increase in government spending and borrowing? An alternative measurement, the Genuine Progress Indicator, was developed by Friends of the Earth to include key environmental health factors. The data included within the GPI reveals that the overall well-being of the U.S. population reached its peak in the 1970s and has been declining ever since. Looking back a century ago, an agricultural boom during the First World War triggered intense land speculation. However, by the mid-1920s, global production had recovered and prices began to fall. All across the United States, property markets were overheating. Investors leveraged themselves to acquire prime locations in Florida and in many growing cities. And of course, the same dynamic drove the stock market to heights not supported by corporate profits. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith pointed to wealth concentration as a contributing stress and cause of the Great Depression. He noted, "The proportion of personal income received in the form of interest, dividends, and rent, the income broadly speaking of the well-to-do, was about twice as great as in the years following the Second World War." The Florida coast was hit with a series of devastating hurricanes between 1926 and 1928. Credit-fueled land speculation imploded, causing thousands of personal bankruptcies and bank failures. Frederick Lewis Allen, in his book Only Yesterday, described how the land market cycle triggered a nationwide depression. In the autumn of 1925, the Florida boom was at its height. Men and women were exposed to the most delirious fever of real estate speculation which had attacked the United States in 90 years. The Florida boom, in fact, was only one, and by all odds the most spectacular, of a series of land and building booms during the post-war decade, each of which had its marked effect upon the national economy and the national life. As land prices fell, investors shifted remaining cash reserves into the stock market, driving up prices far above that justified by corporate profits and forecasts of business activity. By the late 1920s, the credit-fueled speculation ran its course. The fortunate few took their profits and withdrew from the market, leaving most others to face margin calls. Panic selling began on the 29th of October, 1929. Wealth concentration in 1929 imposed an extraordinary stress on the economic system, a threat not approached again until the first decade of the 21st century. From the late 1970s on, the concentrated ownership of household wealth in the United States climbed back up to the level reached on the eve of the Great Depression. Similar concentrations exist in the United Kingdom and Canada. In contrast, France and Japan have not experienced any noticeable increase. However, this distinction did not prevent the 1989 crash of Japanese land markets and the prolonged recessionary downturn that followed there. Farm incomes for many, but far from all farmers, have climbed slowly from mid-1980s lows. Total agricultural debt dropped by 30% from 1984 to 1990, in part because lenders wrote off bad loans, while other farmers managed to pay down their debt. Land prices stabilized and then rose. By 1992, unadjusted for inflation, they roughly had regained their 1984 levels and have continued their upward climb. Why not adjust for inflation? Well, if inflation is defined as an increase over time in the price of a given quantity of an asset, then all increases in the price of land are by definition the result of inflation. Next, here is what has occurred with respect to the equity people have in their residential property. On the surface, the rapid climb in homeowners' equity in real estate ought to be welcomed. Look below the surface, and the implication is more worrisome. This equity is not primarily the outcome of homeowners paying off mortgage debt. It comes from rising land values. For many households seeking to purchase a property at this stage of the property market cycle, the amount of mortgage debt being carried exposes a significant percentage of these owners to default, foreclosure, and eviction. Lot sizes started to fall in the 1980s and have continued to do so in response to escalating land costs. This is the case even for subdivisions constructed several hours by highway or rail line from the historic urban centers. Developers sought variances to existing zoning to permit the construction of more units per acre, or sought permission to construct multi-story condominiums. When local governments and residents opposed these measures, developers kept moving further out from the cities, increasingly beyond connections to municipal water and sewer systems. New construction on close-in, high-priced land has been limited to mega-sized homes and condominiums selling for $1 million and more. Often, more modest existing homes are purchased and either extensively expanded or demolished and replaced. The 2008 crash only briefly reversed the upward climb. Median residential property prices are now higher than at the 2007 peak. The value of most housing, other than those designated for historical significance, is defined as replacement cost less depreciation. Some buildings command a premium over this value because of their historic or architectural uniqueness, but such homes are frequently taken out of the housing supply and converted to museums or protected from replacement by historic designation. In general, the reason why two identical or even similar properties sell for very different prices is the desirability of the location. And generally speaking, what disappears when property markets crash is the speculation-created land value. As prices of land for all uses continue to climb toward the end of the current cycle, the financial stress on businesses that lease their buildings or office spaces will affect profitability. Households who live in apartments will face rising annual rents at the expense of other spending. Those hoping to become first-time homebuyers will face huge problems accumulating savings sufficient for a cash down payment and to cover the closing costs. Pressure will be on local government to find the revenue from state or federal sources to acquire land by purchase or use of eminent domain procedures in order to subsidize the construction of housing units affordable to those with low to moderate incomes. The economic elephant in the room is the unprecedented level of federal debt. Today, the United States government is spending several billions more each day than is taken in as revenue or from other sources. Servicing this debt removes hundreds of billions of dollars annually from funds available for the modernization of the nation's infrastructure and social welfare priorities. There are many solutions under discussion. My own recommendations, detailed later in this presentation, are: first, returning to a much more progressive federal income tax structure while exempting individual incomes up to the national median. Second, as government bonds mature, replacing them with fully amortizing bonds that return both interest and principal to bondholders. Third, require the Federal Reserve to cancel the debt on all government securities held as assets. And fourth, grant private access to public lands only under conditions of competitive bidding. The global pandemic is taking a rising toll on businesses, as evidenced by the increased number of business bankruptcies occurring during 2020. This despite the financial assistance provided by government. As you can see in this graph, the number of personal bankruptcy filings started to climb during 2019, reaching 775,000 for the year ended June 30, 2019. A report released by the U.S. courts indicates that for the year ended June 30, 2020, the number of new filings fell by 11.8% to 682,363. However, the report, not surprisingly, stated as follows: some filing activity also may have been affected by pandemic-related disruptions to bankruptcy courts, many of which have limited public building access since mid-March. Of course, as is widely discussed in the media, the nominal wealth of the world's billionaires and multimillionaires has continued to climb at an astonishing rate. The problems caused by this degree of income and wealth concentration is constantly debated. Should the Democratic Party strengthen its majority in the House of Representatives and gain a majority in the Senate as a result of the 2022 midterm elections, the imposition of a tax based on some calculation of net worth could be on the horizon. Missing from the debates in the United States and other countries is any serious effort to distinguish income that is earned by providing goods and services that people need and want from income derived from the capacity under law to claim what others actually produce. And yet, from the standpoint of either economic efficiency or equity, this is the distinction that is most important. British analyst Fred Harrison has put his finger on the cause of our public policy paralysis. He tells us, the failure to eliminate or control the business cycle despite repeated attempts to do so suggests that the received wisdoms do not lead governments to remedies that work. A second reason is that economics as it is employed today is seriously prejudiced by the dilution of some of its key concepts. Economists routinely work with economic models that treat the world as if it were composed of two factors, labor and capital, instead of the three-factor model favored by the classical economists. This disembodies the economy from its spatial context, for land is the key piece of the jigsaw that is the complex economy. In short, long-standing public policies reward behaviors that are detrimental to communities and to the stable economic growth that would employ every person at a living wage. Our laws have been fine-tuned to defend privilege, to make it both possible and extremely profitable to monopolize and control access to what nature freely provides. To tame the boom-to-bust nature of our economic system, the rental value of land in all its forms must be collected by government for the benefit of all citizens. Despite the logic of what economists and market analysts such as Fred Harrison try to explain, and despite the kind of statistics and facts I have presented here, the likelihood is that our political leaders will continue to succumb to ideological traps, preventing them from coming to the right decisions on changes in law in taxation and public policy. Only an overwhelmingly consistent call for specific systemic changes from the citizenry might have the desired effect. The problem there, of course, is that such a consensus does not exist and is not likely to be forged for at least 2 or 3 generations. As I briefly described earlier, I recommend a number of changes in public policy that would move us closer to where Fred Harrison argues we need to go, which is to a system where public revenue comes from the annual rental or leasehold value that land in all its forms generates. I cannot take the time here to list all the reasons why this change in public policy is both fair and economically wise. There is a wealth of literature published on the subject. So what do we do to move us in the right direction? We in the United States already have state and federal income tax systems in place. These need to be restructured to distinguish between income that is earned by producing goods and providing services and income that is derived from passive and speculative investment activities. The changes I recommend combine dramatic simplification with meaningful progressivity. At the federal level, all individual incomes up to the national median should be exempted from taxation. Each state could decide to use the federal figures or the income figures for the state. All other exemptions and deductions would be eliminated. Then, above the exempted amount, increasing rates of taxation would be applied to higher ranges of income. The rates and ranges of income would be set during the budgeting process to achieve a balanced budget. We cannot allow the federal government to continue to deficit spend. Eventually, the interest costs of servicing the debt will prevent government from allocating funds for essential public goods and services. The answer is twofold. First, gradually retire the outstanding debt held by individuals and private entities by issuing fully amortizing bonds to replace existing bonds as they mature. The amount required to fully repay bondholders, both interest and principal, would be factored into the balanced budget calculations before setting the tax rates on individual incomes. Second, whatever debt is owed by the federal government to the Federal Reserve should simply be canceled. The money to fund this debt was created out of thin air and then spent by the federal government into the economy. The economic effect is potentially inflationary, which is the real cost to the U.S. taxpayers. Local governments raise much of their revenue in ways that are as unfair as they are unwise. What the community has to offer residents and businesses are amenities brought to locations, making those locations desirable and valuable in proportion to the quality of amenities and services. Property markets reflect these differences by higher or lower annual rental values. When these rental values are left untaxed or only mildly taxed, the net imputed income is capitalized into a selling price for land. As economics professor Fred Foldvari argues, the land rental values created by the aggregate public and private investment are public assets and need to be fully collected. Communities can then remove the burden of taxation from homes and other buildings, that is, from assets individuals produce and values individuals create, recognizing that such assets depreciate over time in both functional utility and monetary value, requiring ongoing expenditure for maintenance and periodic replacement of essential systems. The annual tax on property improvements equates to imposition of a sales tax, year after year after year. If this is considered logical, then such a tax ought to be imposed on all depreciating assets. A final proposal affects the taxes imposed on business entities. The existing system asks businesses to file financial statements that record all revenue and all expenses, reducing the revenue to a taxable amount. The tax code is thousands of pages long, with detailed explanations of deductions, exemptions, exclusions, subsidies, and other technical calculations. This tax system requires the expenditure of endless hours and huge amounts of money allocated to compliance and enforcement. A much simpler and I believe better structure would be to impose a low, graduated rate of taxation on gross revenue, exempting from taxation some level of revenue deemed appropriate to encourage smaller-sized businesses. An important side effect of this structure is to encourage companies to closely control expenses, as they would no longer play a role in the firm's actual tax obligation. It is worth noting that 6 states in the United States have adopted a tax on gross receipts. Well, one always has to be hopeful, although the evidence I have presented here gives little reason to be optimistic that the global economy will somehow escape the workings of the land market cycle. The crash may not occur right at 2026. There are measures government might adopt that will extend the cycle for a few years. In the end, we shall see. Thank you.